We're now going to talk about our last type of macromolecule, which is a nucleic acid. So far we've talked about carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. And those are three you probably were already familiar with. You might not have known the term lipid, but you certainly know the term fat, right? And that's what a lipid is. So we know that carbohydrates are what are used for energy production. So we run off of carbs. So if you think about comparing a living organism to a machine, you can think of carbohydrates as the gasoline, right? It's the fuel source that makes the body go, makes the organism run. Fats have a lot of important jobs. Lipids have a lot of important jobs, including insulation, long-term energy storage, and structural stuff like in cell membranes. And then we talked about proteins, which are probably the most important because proteins are the actual physical structures. That's the stuff that the body is made out of. So, for example, your muscles, your skin, your bones, all the enzymes, all the antibodies, pretty much every physical component in the human body and any living organism is going to be made of proteins. So now we're going to talk about the last type, which is nucleic acids. And nucleic acids are probably the one that you're the least familiar with, but you certainly know the example. So what is a nucleic acid? Well, it's a macromolecule, just like the other ones, right? So carbohydrates have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Lipids also have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, just a different ratio. Proteins have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, or CHONs, right? That make them, they're a little more complex, and you have those amino acids which form together to make proteins. And then finally, we have nucleic acids. And these are also a molecule, but they're made up of different types of elements, which we're going to talk about. Let's talk about what it is first. So it's a very complex macromolecule that can do something pretty amazing. It can store genetic information. So what the heck does that mean, right? So you've all heard of the term genetics before, right? If you think about your family, for example, think about your mom and your dad, your brothers, your sisters, your aunts, your uncles, your cousins. And now think about how many characteristics you have in common with them. For example, I have a cousin. He's not even my first cousin. He's a second cousin. I actually don't get along with him. I don't like him at all. But we look very similar. It's weird that we look as similar as we do. When we were little kids, when we were really young, he's a year older than me. So when we were really young, people would sometimes think we were twins when we would be together. And that's because even though we're not that related, we come from the same genetic family tree. So I have some of the traits that he has because eventually somewhere along our family tree, we have the same great-grandparents. So because of that, we have some of the same genetics. So genetics are traits that get passed down from one generation to the next. And that is stored in this thing that we call a nucleic acid. So what are the examples of nucleic acids? Well, you probably already know this, but DNA. And we're going to talk more about that. So a nucleic acid is essentially a large macromolecule that can store information in the form of a code. So just like computers have codes, right? Computers have, some of you guys probably can do some really impressive stuff with computers in terms of programming. And you know that there's a code to computers. And depending on what the code is, you're going to get a different result. So for example, the code for, let's say if you're playing a war game or something, and whoever you're playing, your character has a machine gun. If you were to change the code to that game, you could change the gun to something else, right? Well, that's exactly how DNA works. It codes for proteins, which we're going to talk about. So what make up nucleic acids? Well, there's a certain building block which form together to make a nucleic acid, and they're called nucleotides. So nucleotides are the subunits that form together to make nucleic acids. Just as a comparison, amino acids are the subunits that form together to make proteins, and triglycerides are made of glycerol and 3 fatty acids. Those are the 3 subunits, or 4 subunits, I should say, that make up lipids. So what are the subunits that make up nucleic acids? It's going to be something called a nucleotide. What are the elements found in a macromolecule of nucleic acid? Well, it's going to have carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. So hopefully at this point you realize what 3 elements are found in all 4 types. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. So those are the 3 that are going to be in every single type of macromolecule. But nucleic acids are a little bit different. They have nitrogen and phosphorus instead of nitrogen and sulfur. So proteins, CHONs, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur. Nucleic acids are CHONP, or easier to say, PONCH, P-O-N-C-H. Phosphorus, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, hydrogen. C-H-O-N-P. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, however you want to remember it. The elements that make up nucleic acids are going to be carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Let's talk a little more about this molecule. So what is the job of your nucleic acids? Well, if you take a look here, this is an example of something called RNA. And we're going to learn all about RNA a little later in the year. We're going to get to that probably, hopefully at the end of the second marking period. If not, we'll get to it in the third marking period. But what are the jobs of your nucleic acids? Well, nucleic acids are pretty amazing, but what they are is actually kind of simple. Nucleic acids are a cookbook. That's all it is. It's a cookbook. If I said, all right, guys, your homework tonight is to make your favorite meal, make your favorite dish. Go find a recipe somewhere and then go make your favorite dish. Some of you might make spaghetti, right? You love spaghetti. Some of you might make a chocolate cake because you like sugar, right? But you're going to take a cookbook and you're going to follow that recipe and you're going to make some kind of a food. Why am I talking about this? Because your nucleic acids are recipes, but they're not a recipe for making chocolate cake or spaghetti. They're recipes for making proteins. So if you remember in the last lecture, I said amino acids form together to make proteins. And it's the order and the type of amino acid which makes the type of protein, right? I compared the word dog to the word God. Same letters, just reverse order with different meaning. Well, the amino acids that form together to make proteins, how do they know what order to go in? It's all in the DNA. So what are the jobs and functions of your nucleic acids? They contain hereditary information. What is hereditary information? That is the genetic information that you pass down. So if one day you decide you want to have kids, you're going to meet somebody, you're going to have kids with them. When you decide to have a kid, what's going on there is you are donating half of your DNA, and then your significant other is donating half of their DNA, and then they combine together to make a child. So you're going to get half of the DNA. That's why you look like your mom and your dad. And you probably act more like one than the other, and maybe you look a little more like one than the other, but you are a blend of their traits because they've passed on half of their DNA. And also, it is the instructions on how to make proteins. So, for example, if you've ever heard of lactose intolerance before, we're going to be talking about that in the next section here on enzymes. Lactose intolerant people can't drink milk. And the reason why is because their DNA is coded wrong. And when the protein gets made to digest milk called lactase, it doesn't work right. It's the wrong instructions. So those people can't digest milk. They don't have the sugar for it, or the enzyme to break down the sugar. What are the two examples of nucleic acids that we're going to talk about? DNA and RNA. So what is DNA? DNA is the actual master copy of an organism's genetic code. So every single one of your cells has a copy of your DNA in it. And it should be that they're all the same. So your skin cell has the same copy of DNA as your muscle cell. And your muscle cell has the same copy of DNA as your liver cell, right? And then RNA is what your body, it's a type of nucleic acid which copies information from the DNA and then makes the protein out of it. So think of RNA as the messenger that copies the DNA and then makes the protein. If that's confusing to you right now, that's okay. We are going to make sure we explain it much better when we get to that unit. So just know that a nucleotide forms together to make a strand of DNA, which is a type of nucleic acid. So just to make sure we understand that, I'm going to just draw a quick little picture here. So if I were to say draw DNA, you probably would draw something like this. You've all seen this image before. It's a double-stranded molecule that has these bases that attach in the middle. It's often called a twisted ladder. But let's say I zoom in. If I want to zoom into this image right here, what I would see is I would see something that looks like this. So I'd have this structure of these things called bases and sugar and phosphate. So I just want to make sure we understand what's going on here. So this would be like half of that ladder, right? So each one of these, this is a nucleotide. And then if I combine a bunch of nucleotides together, I get a nucleic acid. So each one of these rungs of the ladder is a nucleotide. So those are the subunits which form together to make up a nucleic acid. So for example, this would be a DNA model. This would be DNA. And DNA is made up, it stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. So there's that nucleic acid term, right? So this is a nucleic acid. And it's called deoxyribo. We'll talk more about that later because that's the kind of sugar that it uses. But for now, you just need to know DNA. Thank you very much.